At 09:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. 27 years old, Illinois state champion, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the past 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. The other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he had unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer wanted to know if this was meant for deer or Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese. They shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands while his own weapons sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December of 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked "Fragile." Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. In the next 4 days, that mail-order rifle would clear the Point Cruz groves of every Japanese sniper the battalion's entire strength could not dislodge in 2 weeks. This is the story of the state champion who carried a civilian hunting rifle into one of the most brutal jungle campaigns in the Pacific. How he proved that individual marksmanship mattered when industrial warfare could not solve the problem. How he killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days with a bolt-action hunting rifle while every officer in his battalion told him he was wrong. And how the book he wrote about it became required reading for military snipers for the next 70 years. John Carroll. George was born October 22, 1915 in Springfield, Illinois. His father was a pharmacist. His mother taught elementary school. The family lived in a modest house on 4th Street, 2 blocks from the state capitol building. George grew up in the kind of America that no longer exists. Quiet neighborhoods, unlocked doors. Every boy with a .22 rifle and permission to use it. His father took him hunting for the first time at age 9. Squirrels in the timber along the Sangamon River. George missed every shot. He was furious about it, not sad, not discouraged, furious. He went back the next week and missed again, and the week after that. By the time he was 12, he wasn't missing anymore. There was something methodical about the way George approached shooting. He didn't just practice, he studied. He read everything available about ballistics, about trigger technique, about breathing. He visited the Springfield rifle range on weekends and watched competitive shooters, asked questions, took notes. By 16, he was shooting at Camp Perry, the National Rifle Range in Ohio. The best target shooters in America went to Camp Perry. George went as a spectator, watched the champions shoot, and decided he would be one of them. He wasn't arrogant about it, just honest with himself about what he was capable of. He enlisted in the Illinois National Guard at 17. The Guard gave him access to training ammunition, to coaches, to competition opportunities. He worked his way through the qualification matches. By 20, he was competing at the state level. In 1939, John George won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, 23 years old, the youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. His fellow National Guardsmen noticed. His commanders noticed. When the Army began mobilizing in 1940, George's marksmanship record made him a candidate for sniper training. Except the Army didn't have a sniper program in 1940. The United States military in the years before Pearl Harbor had no formal doctrine for precision long-range shooting. The Army believed in volume of fire, semi-automatic rifles, fire superiority. The concept of one carefully placed round from a specialized shooter was considered old-fashioned. World War I thinking. George disagreed, but he was a lieutenant. His opinion wasn't asked. He deployed to Camp Forest, Tennessee, with the 132nd Infantry Regiment when the war began. He'd been saving money for 2 years to buy the rifle he wanted. Not a military rifle, a sporting rifle. The Winchester Model 70 was the finest production bolt-action rifle made in America. Introduced in 1936, it had earned a reputation as the rifleman's rifle. Machined receiver, controlled round feeding, crisp trigger, exceptional accuracy. George ordered one through Stoeger's in New York, added a Lyman Alaskan 2.5 power scope in a Griffin and Howe side mount, ordered hunting ammunition in .30-06 Springfield, the same cartridge the Garand fired. Total cost, 2 years of National Guard pay. When the crate arrived at Camp Forest, George assembled the rifle in the company day room. The armorer watched with visible skepticism. "That's a hunting rifle," the armorer said. George acknowledged it was. "We issue Garands here." The armorer gestured at the rack of semi-automatic rifles. 8 rounds. Fast. Reliable. "What you've got there is 5 rounds and a bolt." George explained that 5 carefully placed rounds at 400 yards were more useful than 8 rounds at 150. The armorer wasn't convinced. Neither was anyone else. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry shipped out for the Pacific in October 1942. The Winchester sat in a warehouse in Illinois, still waiting to be forwarded. George wrote the request every week, followed up through channels, told himself it would arrive in time. It arrived in late December 1942, 2 weeks after his battalion had taken its first casualties on Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal campaign had been grinding since August. The Marines had landed, taken Henderson Field, held it against everything Japan threw at them. But they hadn't cleared the island. Japanese forces still held Mount Austin to the south, still controlled the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. By the time the 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines in late December, the island smelled like death and rot. The jungle was so thick that patrols 20 yards apart couldn't see each other. Malaria was killing men faster than Japanese bullets. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Gifu, with 500 men, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days, lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd. During those 16 days, George fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The fighting on Mount Austin was bunker to bunker, grenade range, bayonet range. Nobody needed precision long-range shooting to kill a man through an embrasure at 15 yards. The officers who had mocked his rifle felt vindicated. Then the battalion moved to the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. The jungle around Point Cruz was different from Mount Austin. No fixed positions, no defined lines, just massive trees, dense undergrowth, and Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and embedded themselves in the forest. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They had scoped Arisaka Type 99 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. They had been trained for exactly this kind of warfare. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. 1 shot. The men with him never heard where it came from. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. Both shots came from the same direction. The patrol searched for 40 minutes, found nothing. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. 14 men in 72 hours, all from concealed positions. None of the shooters were found. The battalion commander summoned George that night. The room was quiet except for the sound of distant artillery. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, the youngest winner in the state's history. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You've got until morning to prove it. If that toy rifle can't do the job, you carry a Garand like everyone else." George spent the night cleaning his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again, checked the scope mounts, loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. At dawn, on January 22nd, he moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that area, banyan trees. Some reached 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one before dawn and sit there all day without being seen. The canopy was so dense that a man in dark clothing, motionless, was invisible from below. George brought no spotter, no radio man. Just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to watch the trees. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification, not much by later standards, but enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, the distant sound of artillery. George filtered out the noise and focused on movement. He glassed each tree slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 0917, he saw it. A branch moved, no wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man, dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing, exhaled halfway, held. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches. His body tumbled 90 feet and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round, kept his scope on the tree, waited for movement. Nothing. The sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or the trees nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 0943, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper fell backward off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. Basic sniper doctrine. Shoot and relocate. But in jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 1138. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon on January 22nd, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion before the sun moved. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. A crowd meant noise. Noise meant movement. Movement meant the next Japanese sniper would know exactly where he was. He worked alone. On January 23rd, George changed positions. Good snipers never used the same location twice. He moved to a shallow ravine 180 yards east of the previous bunker. Lower elevation, different sight lines. The Japanese had adjusted too. The remaining snipers had moved deeper into the grove. They were higher in the trees now, harder to spot. George spent 3 hours glassing before he found the first target of day 2, 110 feet up, the highest position he'd seen yet. The man was still, completely motionless. If George hadn't been watching that specific tree for 20 minutes, he would have missed him. At 08:34, he fired. The shot was 310 yards, long for the conditions. The bullet had to thread through a gap in the canopy. George had calculated the trajectory, accounted for the downward angle, held his breath for 6 seconds before the trigger broke. The Japanese sniper toppled from his position without a sound. 6th kill. At 10:47, a second sniper opened fire from the northwest. The bullet was close, within a foot. The shooter was good. Had identified George's general position from the previous shot's sound. George relocated immediately, moved 40 yards east, low-crawled through undergrowth that tore at his uniform, settled into a new position behind a fallen log. He glassed northwest for 25 minutes, found nothing. The Japanese sniper was patient, disciplined. George changed his approach. He stopped looking for the man. He started looking for the rifle. A Japanese Type 99 scope had a distinctive glint in certain light conditions. Not bright, not obvious, just a small irregularity in the way light moved through the foliage. At 12:14, George saw it. A subtle flash, 50 feet up, 190 yards northwest. The Japanese sniper had shifted position between George's 2 scans, had moved laterally along a large branch. That movement caught a momentary angle of sunlight on the scope lens. George fired. 7th kill, day 3. January 24th. George had been sleeping 4 hours a night, eating cold rations in the dark. The strain was beginning to show. But so was the effect on the Japanese. The remaining 4 snipers had changed tactics. They were no longer taking shots at American patrols. They were hunting George. He knew this because on the morning of the 24th, he found a position that had been occupied recently. Fresh scrapes onto bark, folded vegetation that had been cleared for a field of fire. The Japanese sniper had been there before dawn, waiting. The position had a direct line of sight to George's bunker from day 1. The position he hadn't used in 2 days. They were trying to ambush him where he'd been, not where he was. George studied the ground carefully. The sniper who had prepared this position would have a secondary position nearby. When George didn't appear at the bunker, the sniper would retreat to the secondary and wait. George spent 2 hours working through the jungle to a position 60 yards southeast of where the ambush site faced. He was now looking at the ambush site from the side. At 131, the Japanese sniper returned to his prepared position. He came in from the north, moving carefully, checking for movement ahead of him. He never checked his flank. George fired from 80 yards, close enough to be absolutely certain. The 8th sniper died before he understood what had happened. The 9th kill came at 13:47 the same day, a sniper who opened fire on an American patrol from 130 yards distance. 3 shots in quick succession. The patrol scattered. George was 200 yards north when he heard the shots. He moved toward the sound. The sniper was still in position, tracking the patrol, looking for a fourth shot. George found him at 70 yards, broadside position. No calculation needed. 9 kills in 3 days. 2 snipers remaining. On January 25th, the last 2 Japanese snipers came for him together. The first shot came at 07:48 before full light. It hit 8 inches from George's head, closer than anything before. The Japanese sniper had seen him moving into position in the pre-dawn darkness. George dropped flat and rolled into a depression in the ground, stayed motionless. The second shot came 30 seconds later from a different direction. These two were coordinated. One would fire to mark his position. The second would take the shot when George moved in response to the first. Standard doctrine for 2-man sniper teams hunting a target. George recognized the tactic because he knew the doctrine. He'd studied Japanese military manuals captured on Guadalcanal. He'd read about their sniper training methods. He knew what they were doing. He didn't move. He lay in the depression for 22 minutes without moving. Not a hand, not a head turn. Absolute stillness. The Japanese snipers waited for him to react. He didn't react. At 08:10, one of them moved, shifted position slightly to get a better angle on the depression where they'd last seen him. The movement was 40 feet up in a banyan tree 155 yards west. George had not moved his rifle during the 22 minutes, hadn't shifted his grip, hadn't adjusted his body. His position was exactly as it had been when he went flat. The scope was already pointing roughly west. He made a 2-degree adjustment with his right hand. No other movement. Aimed. Fired. The 10th sniper fell from the tree. The 11th sniper's location was revealed by the shot. When George fired, the remaining Japanese soldier broke from his position, a trained soldier. He'd realized in that moment that staying was death. He dropped from his tree and ran northeast through the undergrowth. George tracked the movement through his scope. Running target, dense vegetation, 70 yards between them. The Winchester's bolt moved smoothly. He chambered the last round in the magazine, aimed ahead of the running figure, calculated speed, distance, angle, fired. The 11th sniper went down in the undergrowth and did not get up. 4 days, 11 Japanese snipers, 14 American soldiers dead before George started. 0 American casualties during the 4 days he worked. The battalion commander had the results on his desk by noon. He called George in. The mail-order rifle that couldn't do a real soldier's work had just done what his entire battalion hadn't been able to do in 2 weeks. He didn't apologize for what he'd said. Commanders rarely did. But he filed a commendation that afternoon. George never asked what happened to it. The recognition that came wasn't formal. It was quieter than that, more meaningful. The officers who had mocked him stopped mocking him. The men who had questioned the rifle stopped questioning it. More importantly, the battalion command started paying attention to what George had been saying for months. That precision marksmanship wasn't obsolete. That individual skill had a role in modern warfare that volume of fire couldn't fill. George spent the next 3 weeks training selected soldiers in the basics of stalking, observation, and long-range shooting. He had no official program, no curriculum. He taught what he knew. The lessons were simple. Patience beats speed. Observation beats reaction. 1 accurate shot beats 10 inaccurate ones. Guadalcanal was secured on February 9, 1943. The Japanese evacuated what remained of their forces during the night. The campaign that had cost 7,000 American casualties and 38,000 Japanese was over. George had been there for 6 weeks. He had fired his Winchester fewer than 20 times in combat. Each shot had counted. The Army reassigned him to Merrill's Marauders, the special operations unit being formed for the Burma campaign. They had heard about the Point Cruz shooting. They wanted him. Merrill's Marauders were officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit, 5,300 men, all volunteers. They were told the mission would be extremely hazardous. That was accurate. The mission was to penetrate deep behind Japanese lines in Burma, attack supply routes, disrupt communications, create chaos in the Japanese rear while Chinese and American regular forces pressed from the front. George reported to the unit in India in November 1943. The Marauders trained for 2 months in the jungle near Deoghar. The training was brutal. Long marches, heavy loads, eating whatever the jungle provided when supply couldn't reach them. George carried his Winchester. Nobody said anything about it this time. The Marauders entered Burma on February 24, 1944. George's battalion was in the second echelon. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases multiplied. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. The unit had been pinned down for 40 minutes. George crawled to an elevated position, took 1 shot, and the ambush dissolved when the officer went down. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. The gun had killed 2 Marauders. It was dug in well, difficult for the regular assault teams to approach. George's round came from an angle the crew wasn't watching, once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned a Marauder patrol for 2 hours. 1 shot. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. He learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effective. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success. The cost had been severe. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived it too. But the rifle that had proved so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. Modern jungle warfare was mostly close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less. Firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. There was no room for precision long-range shooting when the enemy was 15 yards away. George realized something in those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But warfare had changed. The Pacific Campaign had become an industrial operation, mass production, standardization, interchangeable parts. The individual craftsman with a personally owned weapon was being replaced by uniformed soldiers with identical equipment. George understood the necessity. He just wasn't certain something important wasn't being lost. He was evacuated from Burma in June 1944 with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. He was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons from Guadalcanal and Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. He was discharged from the Army in January 1947, Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University, on the GI Bill. What happened next surprised everyone who had known him as a combat soldier. George excelled academically, not competently, exceptionally. He'd always had the methodical mind of a marksman, the discipline to study a problem from every angle before acting. That same quality that made him the best shot in Illinois made him one of the best students at Princeton. He graduated with highest honors in 1950. Then, 4 years at Oxford. Then, 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. The state champion rifleman became a diplomat. None of his colleagues in Washington knew about Guadalcanal. None of them knew about Point Cruz. They knew he had served in the Pacific, but the details weren't something George discussed. He had colleagues who could talk about the war for hours. George wasn't one of them. The experiences were too personal, too raw in ways that didn't diminish with time. The men he'd shot at Point Cruz stayed with him. Not as guilt. He never felt guilt about it. They were professional soldiers doing what professional soldiers do. They would have killed his men without hesitation. But they stayed with him. The precision of it, the finality. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh, before memory started softening the edges. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. Every chapter was clinical. Detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics, step-by-step accounts of individual engagements, observations about Japanese weapons and tactics, technical analysis of what worked, what failed, and why. No embellishment, no heroics, just facts and observations written with the same precision he brought to everything else. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was too technical for general readers, too specific, too detailed. The NRA persuaded him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger, a technical account of what happened to an American rifleman in the jungles of the Pacific. It did not become a bestseller. It did not make George famous. Most people had never heard of it. But among firearms enthusiasts, among military historians, among the small community of serious marksmen, it became a classic. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with a precision that no other contemporary account matched. His descriptions of Japanese weapons, specifically the Type 99 Arisaka and its scope, remain some of the most detailed first-hand accounts available for decades. Military historians used it, collectors used it, writers researching Pacific combat used it, and gradually, quietly, military snipers started reading it. The Army didn't have a formal sniper school in 1947. It barely had one in 1960. The concept of dedicated long-range precision shooting as a military specialty was still being worked out institutionally. But the men who did that work, the early military snipers, the trainers who built the doctrine, they found George's book. They found it because it described exactly what they were trying to figure out: how to apply precision shooting in a combat environment, what it felt like to hunt another trained shooter who was simultaneously hunting you, what worked at 300 yards that didn't work at 30. Shots Fired in Anger is still in print today, still cited by firearms historians, still used as a reference for studying World War II small arms. The book George wrote because he wanted to document what happened before he forgot the details has outlasted nearly everything else from that period. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training programs and purpose-built equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers who had never heard of Point Cruz. In his later years, George occasionally spoke with military historians about Guadalcanal. He was precise about the details, never inflated the numbers, never dramatized the events. 11 snipers in 4 days, 14 American soldiers prevented from dying. One Winchester Model 70 that should have stayed in a warehouse in Illinois. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way only people who have actually done difficult things can be. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. 9 pounds, walnut stock, blued steel barrel, a 2.5 power scope, and a side mount. Nothing about it looks like a weapon that changed the course of a battle. Nothing about it looks like the rifle that cleared a jungle grove in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. But that's often how the most important things look. Ordinary, unremarkable, easily dismissed. The officers who called it a mail-order toy weren't wrong about what it was. They were wrong about what it could do in the hands of the right man. That's the other story here. Not just the rifle, the man. John George was a state champion before the Army knew it wanted state champions. He understood precision when military doctrine was built around volume. He saw value in individual skill when the institution was moving toward interchangeable standardization. He was right. The institution eventually caught up. The modern military sniper programs that have produced some of the most effective soldiers in recent wars trace their conceptual roots back to men like George, to the lessons he wrote down in 1947, to the proof he provided at Point Cruz that one accurate shot placed by one skilled shooter could accomplish what dozens of men with semi-automatic rifles could not. 11 kills in 4 days. Not because of superior weapons. The Winchester Model 70 was not a superior military weapon by any objective standard. Bolt action, 5 rounds, slower than the standard issue rifle. 11 kills because of superior training, superior patience, superior observation. Because George had spent years learning to control his breathing, his trigger, his mind. Because he had outworked every shooter in Illinois before he ever heard of Guadalcanal. The men who died at Point Cruz before January 22nd died because the American military in 1943 had no institutional answer to train Japanese snipers in jungle terrain. They had rifles. They had men. They lacked the specific skill those conditions required. George provided that skill. 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 box of hunting ammunition. The battalion commander who told him to prove it or carry a Garand got his proof. He never called it a mail-order toy again. Nobody did. The Winchester Model 70 is in Fairfax, Virginia today. If you visit the National Firearms Museum, you might walk past it. It's the hunting rifle in the display case with the placard most visitors don't read.